Okay, we're going to talk about acid-base balance, pH. So it is integral to physiology, to the homeostasis of the body. pH has to be kept very, very tightly regulated. In arterial blood, the pH is 7.4, so it's slightly alkaline. Venous blood is a little bit more acidic because there's some more carbon dioxide, which is carbonic acid, so it's 7.35. The intracellular fluid is a pH of 7, which is neutral. So you end up with alkalosis if pH gets above 7.45, acidosis if it gets below 7.35. So the normal is 7.35 to 7.45. That's the range we're going to keep it in. So pH is really a measure of how many hydrogen ions there are. So most of the hydrogen comes from metabolism, from lactic acid, from fatty acids, and from carbon dioxide. Because carbon dioxide, when mixed with water, CO2 becomes H2CO4 or CO3. So CO2 and H2O, H2CO3, and that becomes H plus and HCO3 minus, which is bicarbonate. Proteins break down and become phosphoric acid. So we have to regulate this. And there's three basically regulatory things. Either we bind up these hydrogen ions using a buffer system, or we breathe them away by changing our breathing rates, or we piss them away using renal mechanisms. The chemical buffer systems is almost instantaneous. The breathing takes a couple or 3 minutes, and the renal mechanisms to pee them away might take hours, maybe even days to get into a balance. The advantage to the chemical buffer system is fast. The disadvantage is that you still have these ions there. The advantage to the respiratory is that it acts pretty quickly, gets rid of hydrogen ions, but often leaves the wrong anions behind. The advantage to the renal is that although it's slow, it's the correct acids that are being excreted, and so the anions are going with the hydrogen ions. So to understand how this is going to work, we have to understand that there's association and dissociation. So an acid is held together by ionic bonds. The hydrogen ion has an ionic bond with the anion. If it's a strong acid, it dissociates almost completely in water and releases a lot of hydrogen ions, and so the hydrogen ion content goes way up. A weak acid will partially dissociate. It will associate or dissociate fairly evenly. So strong bases quickly dissociate in water, and they bind up the extra hydrogen. Weak bases accept hydrogen ions more slowly. So if we look at this, so hydrochloric acid almost entirely becomes hydrogen ions and chlorine. It's a strong acid. A weak acid, like carbonic acid, some of it stays as carbonic acid, and some of it dissociates to bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. So there's these chemical buffer systems, and really they are they resist change when a strong acid or base is added. So in the extracellular compartment, The bicarbonate buffer system is the most important one. In the intracellular space, the phosphate and the protein buffer systems are more important. So, before I get into each of these, I'm going to talk for a moment about buffering. And I'm going to use an analogy. A good analogy is your bank accounts and your income. So say, for the sake of argument, that your expenses for a month, your rent and your utilities and your car payment and all of that stuff comes to $2,000 a month. And you need $2,000 every month in your checking account to pay your bills. And you have a job. And 1 month you make $2,200. $2,000 goes into your checking account and pays your bills. $200 of it goes into your savings account. The next month you earn $2,100. $2,000 into the checking account, pays the bills, $100 into the savings account. The next month you earn $2,000. $2,000 into the checking account, pays your bills. The month after that, you earn $1,800. It's a slow month. So now $1,800 goes into the checking account from your income. $200 comes from your savings account. $2,000 pays your bills. The next month you earn $1,900. $19 goes into the checking, $100 from savings, and you still have $2,000 in your checking account to pay your bills. In all of those situations, you end up with $2,000 in your checking account. So what we can say is that the savings account buffered your income, buffered your checking account. So it absorbed any extra that you earn, and it provided any shortfall. And it's going to be the same thing with strong acids and weak acids. If you think of the strong acid as the income, the pH is the checking account, and the weak acid is your savings account. So if you have more strong acid giving more hydrogen ions, then the weak acid associates and takes those hydrogen ions away and leaves us with a stable pH. If there's less strong acid providing hydrogen, then the weak acids dissociate and provide the hydrogen, and the pH stays the same. So the weak acid buffers the strong acid. It happens all the time. There's a strong acid in our stomach, hydrochloric acid, and especially if we eat proteins, we secrete a lot of it. It gives us indigestion. If you drink wine, which has tannic acids and a little bit of acid in it, but they're weak acids, you can buffer the strong acid of the stomach acid. Coffee and tea do the same thing because there's weak acids in that. Lemony desserts, that kind of thing. Vinegars will do it. So, the most important one in the extracellular fluid is when we take carbon dioxide, which is constantly being produced by the cells, and it going into the extracellular fluid, when it mixes with water, we get H2CO3, which is a weak acid. Right? It'll buffer just about everything, but it's the only important extracellular buffer. So if a strong acid is added, the HCO3, the bicarbonate, associates, ties up hydrogen ions, and now the pH increases. Right. Sodium bicarbonate will become carbonic acid and sodium chloride with HCl, and so it it will buffer any pH change, and pH stays the same. So really what happens is carbon dioxide as carbonic acid dissociated is the weak acid and will associate if there's extra hydrogen, dissociate if there's not enough. Right. Carbonic acid is almost limitless because carbon dioxide is released by respiration. And we can control it by respiratory measures. You breathe more and you lose more. You breathe less, you retain more. Phosphates do almost the exact same thing, except it's H2PO4, which is the weak acid. And this is the P of ADP, ATP. So there's a lot of it. So especially intracellularly, because it's produced every time we turn ATP into ADP. And it will buffer. Proteins will act as buffers because proteins can be a weak acid because of the amino acid side. So it will bind hydrogen if there's too much hydrogen. Physiologically, we buffer, so we can use respiratory measures. They're a little more slowly, but they have more capacity. So a very important one is the respiratory. Because we ventilate, we eliminate carbon dioxide. And so this CO2 plus H2O becoming H2CO3, which becomes this, hydrogen and bicarbonate, will produce hydrogen ions, or it can go this way and produce carbon dioxide, and you can breathe that out. So when we're unloading, the reaction shifts this way and things become carbon dioxide. When we're loading CO2, it goes the other way. So hypercapnia is too much carbon dioxide. And so that creates a lower pH, more hydrogen ions, and it causes you to breathe more. So, and you lose that. If you're slightly alkaline, it depresses the respiratory centers and you get apnea, and the hydrogen ions concentration goes up. Now, if you hypoventilate for any reason, like say you have asthma or COPD or something like that, not enough ventilation, you end up with respiratory acidosis. Your body becomes too acidic because of the lack of ventilation. Respiratory, and it's acidosis. So the pH is down because respiration is down. Hyperventilation, because you're excited or angry or in pain, you start to hyperventilate, you end up in respiratory alkalosis. Your pH is too high because of your breathing patterns. So the lungs eliminate this carbonic acid by eliminating carbon dioxide. Kidneys will eliminate the other metabolic acids because of metabolic acidosis and alkalosis. So I don't really care about this, but it's basically peeing things away. Renal is like hydrogen ion secretions and that, but you end up peeing things away. And this gets right into all the bicarbonate. The biggest thing about the metabolic acidosis and alkalosis, it's acidosis caused by metabolic acids. So like lactic acid, for instance, if that builds up, you will end up in a metabolic acidosis. Your pH is low because of metabolic, something other than breathing, something other than carbon dioxide. A metabolic alkalosis is a loss of acids because of metabolic processes. So vomiting is a big thing. You make hydrochloric acid, you normally reabsorb that, but if you puke, you lose it to your body, and your body can end up in an alkalosis. Diarrhea can cause it. So it's a loss of acids from the body. Now, what's interesting is the way we maintain our pH when you're in metabolic acidosis, so too much acidity, then you will actually compensate by hyperventilating to try and go into respiratory alkalosis to compensate. If you're in metabolic alkalosis, then you end up with apnea. You hold your breath to try and increase the amount of hydrogen ions so that your pH is correct. It makes the pH correct, but it's the wrong acid that's being blown off. So we can follow all along this, but it really gets more complicated than we need. And reabsorbing bicarbonate. So respiratory acidosis and alkalosis and metabolic are two separate things. So in respiratory, we end up with partial pressures of carbon dioxide above 45. So we have more carbonic acid, more PCO2. And it's due to decreased in ventilation. pH goes down. You're in acidosis. If you are hyperventilating because of stress or pain or fear or anything, you've been crying, or you're doing it on purpose, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide drops, and you end up in respiratory alkalosis. Metabolic is any pH imbalance not caused by CO2. So you can get acidosis, but too much alcohol, which becomes acetic acid. Loss of HCO3, bicarbonate, in persistent diarrhea. Accumulation of lactic acid, keto acids, starvation, kidney failure. Right? Metabolic alkalosis is usually vomiting by losing hydrogen ions from the hydrochloric acid in your stomach. When blood pH goes too low, so you're in acidosis, central nervous system is depressed, and it can lead to coma and death. If it goes too high, you get too much excitation of the nervous system, muscle tetany, nervousness, convulsions, respiratory arrest. Right? Respiratory mechanisms attempt to correct the imbalances, and then kidneys attempt to correct the respiratory acid-base imbalance. So you correct the metabolic using respiratory mechanisms, then you correct it with kidneys. So when you have metabolic acidosis, the high hydrogen stimulates the respiratory centers, your breathing rates and depths are elevated, blood pH changes, and you end up at the 735, 745 because you've blown off the extra carbon dioxide and you've lost carbonic acid. So metabolic alkalosis, you have slow, shallow breathing, and then that makes your pH go down because it was too high. Renal compensation then happens to correct that. So hypoventilation elevates the CO2, that's respiratory acidosis, and then renal makes you pee out the HCO3, and then it compensates that way. And the opposite for alkalosis.